Slightly better. Okay, can you all hear me from the back? And I guess, yeah, I'll take that as a positive answer. All right, okay, so let me put a timer because otherwise I know I'll get lost. And then we'll realize there's something went clearly wrong at some point. So here we go. Right, so I want to, oops. My voice is probably a bit too loud for this. Okay, I want to do something that I would call mathematizing some ideas. And I'm going to take, well, these are not exactly the words of Sophie, but she actually said something to me and some colleagues that goes along those lines before. Just because you have some mathematical symbols doesn't mean you're doing maths. So what I'm trying to do now is actually do some maths. Math requires some symbols. But just because you see symbols, well, if you find them confusing, probably it's because these people are not doing maths. They're actually doing a lot of really complicated things, sometimes maybe more engineering, sometimes maybe, some other really cool stuff, but it's not maths in the sense that it's not clear. Now, I don't have the ambition of all understanding what I'm going to try to say, partly, and I would say probably, largely in part because, I won't be able to explain everything I want, in the time given, and also because maybe my explanation will not be that great. But I'm saying this is what I'm trying to pursue. Right. So there will be a very long intro, and then the punchline will be rather short because in a way I will just have some, discussion at the very end. I don't have clear answers because most of the process is just trying to put into maths some ideas that I've seen a bit floating around. So I'm going to start with some small connection to some stuff from ASC last week, and then, dive more into the problem at hand. And the predictive coding framework that I'm interested in, well, still partially, I guess. And then some maths that I'm using to formalize some of that. And by the end of it, hopefully some useful reflections. So connections, I don't presuppose all of you are going to agree. But let's say there were two symposia last week at ASSE, one on, there were clearly other ones. But two of the ones I attended, one on mathematical structure of functional experience and one on computational functionalism. And I have to say that I went in and I just got out more confused than when I actually attended, before getting into this symposia, because there were a lot of ideas floating around and I just felt that various people were talking about different things. So I'm going to try and say that my perspective, and you might say, I disagree, but then I'm going to ask you, on what? And then, we're going to make some progress, and that's good. My perspective is, okay, these are just some definitions that I found online and I thought were pretty interesting. Okay, so what is the mathematical structure of consciousness? Well, when things actually compose together, and that gives us some structure about, how we perceive the world and how we actually create mental images of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And what is computational functionalism? Well, part of the definition at least is that we should care more about, what a system does than what a system actually is. Now you might say, well, I have a different idea in mind. Great, tell me what it is. And then, again, we can make some progress. Why am I bringing this out? Well, in maths and theoretical neuroscience, turns out that people have been thinking about the same thing for a while and actually have some maths. So I'm highlighting some stuff here. There's something that these people have described as the duality of structure and behavior. And funnily enough, by the end of this blog post, they pose a question that I believe should be of interest to a lot of us here. Is a thing best defined by its constituent parts, structure, or by its observable actions, behaviors? Now, to actually formalize this kind of stuff, they use this idea of duality that comes out in abstract mathematics, especially category theory. And here they bring out some examples for this particular case, where the duality is between something called algebras and something called coalgebras. Now, algebras is something that you probably have seen before. I'll give you a mathematical expression, some brackets, and then you slowly start to, solve an equation. And you're basically composing parts until you get the final result. Coalgebras might be a bit less, known, but they're also quite common. So in this blog post, they bring out this example. You have a stream of data, and then basically you have some program that tells you the head, so the first thing of the stream of data, and then, you know, calls the rest of the stream the new stream. And you can keep on doing this by just basically popping out the head of this stream. Good. This is intuition. Then I'm going to have something more to say. Okay, so this is my setup. I care about agents, and I care about agents that interact with the environment. They take observations, and they act on the world. I also care about brains, and this is factorization that you might have seen before in various shapes and forms, where I take the agent and I say, well, I'm going to look at the brain of the agent, and I'm going to look at the body of the agent. And you might have seen this in a different form before. This is coming from Randa B, a paper from 1995. Oh, no, I think this is 1997. 1995, we just had agent and environment, which was also clearly inspirational for the type of problem I'm interested in. Now, why am I bringing this out? Well, if you've seen some predictive coding, active inference, free energy principle, Bayesian brain, I don't know, use whatever label comes to mind, you might have seen a graphic of this kind. You have something, well, they call them internal states and external states, and I'm going to, you know, for now, call them brain and environment for consistency, but of course, you know, that's something I will discuss at the end. It's not necessarily obvious. And the thing in the middle, sensors and actuators constitute something like the body, like the thing that separates what's inside from what's outside. Great. So some other, like, you know, small distinction I'm going to make. Free energy principle, now going to be slightly more clear, is what I believe to be a theory of agents. So what agents are. So there is a theory by Carl Friston and collaborators that is trying to tell us, well, a thing is a thing if it appears to minimize variation of free energy, kind of. This I will use as a different thing from something that in the literature appears as active inference, which in my head, and I think, well, in many other people's heads, is basically just an alternative to reinforcement learning. You still have partially observable macro decision processes as your problems, and then you're just choosing a different cost function and a different minimization procedure and a different whatever, but the setup is the same. The problem is the same. These two don't have to be related. It's fine if they are. Sometimes they say, oh, the free energy principle implies this second one. I don't know. I think I will work somewhere in the middle where I kind of want to talk about the free energy principle, so what agents are. But if I had to bring out some match, it will have to be consistent with this just because it's quite simple. Cool. Okay. What is the gist, in my opinion, of predictive coding and similar approaches, active inference, and other things that fall under the idea of the free energy principle? This is taken from the Active Inference book, 2023. We have a model, we have a process, generative model, generative process. The generative model is kind of the environment that I drew before, and the generative model is kind of the brain that I drew before. The idea is that the agent takes some observations, why, and then somehow creates a model of the world that is somehow predicting or basically recreating an explanation for these observations, why. Okay, great. So I will now introduce the two commandments that I'm going to follow when I talk about predictive coding for the rest of the talk. I don't want to call them axioms because I think axioms is not a great idea. Commandments, you know, at least you're kind of saying these are just my assumptions. And then again, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Great. Then we can, you know, move the discussion forward. So first commandment, the generative model is a thing that produces the same observations that the generative process is actually producing. So somehow it is creating an explanation for the observations that an agent is receiving. Second commandment, and this was kind of like the core of my PhD thesis, this generative model doesn't have to be a copy, a mirror of the generative process. And by that, I mean, it doesn't have to be structurally the same. Now, I had a bunch of simulations like to show that, and nowadays, years later, I think I can finally say something a bit more interesting. Cool. So, half new perspective. Why do I say half? Well, I'm going to claim the free energy principle as presented usually is quite confusing. And I don't think this is a major, news to anyone. So if I bring out a bunch of equations, so like here, and I can actually tell you exactly what each one of them is doing, do things need to be Gaussian? Why do things need to have high dimensional something? Does this thing need to be diagonal? Or I don't know why. So the point is, I don't understand what the problem is. I don't understand what the algorithms are. I don't understand what the implementation, say, software-related issues are. And I want those things to be, seen differently. I understand that, engineering-wise, some people might just say, I don't care. I just want to implement this thing and it will work. That's great. That's not the talk I'm trying to give. I'm trying to understand what the problem is. Cool. Half new because I'm going to claim that, the main idea behind the free energy principle is at least 50 years old, because there was some maths there. And again, because I'm mostly just going to try to disentangle problems from algorithms from implementation assumptions. So idea from 50 years ago, this is control theory. People kind of do similar things to the diagrams I drew before. Instead of calling them brains, they call them controllers. Instead of calling them bodies, they call them plants. There's this nice thing in control theory called internal model principle. This idea comes out in at least 17 different implementations, and it's not important here that I actually go through all of them. It is important that at least I try to give you an idea of one that I consider relevant. So in this picture we have, I'm still going to call I don't know if you see what this was supposed to be yellow, like in the slide. So, bear with me when I say yellow, and perhaps you don't exactly see yellow. So the yellow thing I'm still going to call agent. And this agent is getting something from the environment, perturbations, and it doesn't like perturbations, and it can still act on the environment. One strategy for an agent that doesn't like perturbations is to say, oh, can we send back actions to the controller? And for those of you that actually do some control motor neuroscience, this should sound familiar. This is where reference copy comes out as a concept, at least computationally. I can give back a copy of the actions to the controller, and then I'm going to ask the controller to produce counter perturbations. So basically, Newtonian's third law, push back when they are kind of pushing against you, something like that. Great. This is kind of it. This is like an example of an agent that, at least in control theoretic terms, is homeostatic. It kind of counteracts perturbations, disturbances from the environment that it doesn't like. Good. This is where I'm going to ask you to be patient, because this is a bit of math that I'm going to have to introduce. If you don't like it, hopefully you will at least get intuition later on. So I want to have maths that talk about boxes without inputs and outputs. So I'm going to have dynamical systems. Dynamical systems in the classical way are just a state space and transition map. And here, in the language that I'm going to introduce now, they look exactly the same. State space and a transition map, like something that updates the state space over time. For outputs, not very different, really. I'm just going to have updates of states and actually outputs. For inputs, this is a bit weird, but it kind of has a meaning. Instead of having inputs on the left, I'm going to have inputs on the right, as this exponent over here. This this kind of means that I want to have access to all of the possible maps from all of the possible inputs to the next state. So a bit weird, but actually it has a reason to be that way. And if you want, I can try and tell you about it at the end of the talk. Now I can combine these two things together, and I have systems with inputs and outputs. And then the cool thing is that I can just keep on composing things, like, one at a time. To get probabilities, I just need to put probabilities in front of it. If I want to have a non-deterministic automata, I just need to put some power set thing in there. And if I want trees, I just need to put something that actually multiplies, and so on and so forth. Great. Two things that I'm gonna need you to bear with me for. I want to have maps between dynamical systems. So the thing on the left is a dynamical system. The thing on the right is a dynamical system. A map between dynamical systems is something that says, well, if you first map a state now from the left dynamical system to the right one and then update, you should get the same result as first updating on the system on the left and then mapping to the system on the right. This is pretty interesting and cool because it allows me to get, okay, well, this is for open systems. So inputs and outputs, kind of the same thing. It's just more complicated because now I also have inputs and outputs. The cool thing about this is that it allows me to actually talk about something called behavioral equivalence. So this is used quite a lot in theoretical computer science, where people say, if I have two softwares, I want to give these two softwares the same inputs, assuming that I don't know anything about their structure. And I just want to check if they're going to give me the same sequence of outputs. If they do, I'm going to say that they have behaviorally equivalence. I may never be able to say anything about their structural properties, but I just know that they're behaving the same way. Cool. Well, hopefully you start to see where I'm trying to go with this. So as I said, reaching a conclusion very soon. That is going to be quite brief. If you're familiar with functions and relations, by the way, in set, the two things I just presented, maps of systems and behavioral equivalence, are kind of like the same thing as the difference between a function and a relation. If you're not familiar with it, that's fine. This is just good in case you actually knew about this already. Cool. So the solution that I'm trying to propose. So my two commandments on the left, and I'm going to claim, well, that simply means that the generative model is in a bisimulation relation with the generative process. And hopefully you're going to see what I mean in a second. And then I also have something to say about the second one that is actually pretty hot in machine learning still, but let's see how much time I'm left with. All right. So same thing I had before. There's a generative model and there's a generative process. Now, I said earlier that the generative model is supposed to give me the same outputs as the generative process. At least that's what I read from a lot of predictive coding literature. How do I formalize that? Well, with something of this kind. It might look scary, but it's kind of the same thing as before. So I have a brain, I have a dynamical system, brain, that takes inputs and gives out outputs. And I have an environment, takes in inputs, gives out outputs. Now, these inputs and outputs are the same type because efference, copy, counter perturbations, if you remember that picture. And this diagram is simply capturing the idea that the consistency between inputs and outputs must be maintained over time. So if I give them an input to the same input to the two systems and they give me the same output, well, they need to keep on giving me the same thing. That's what it means for a generative model to be I would claim, an optimal generative model. All right. So, okay, action-oriented generative models. This was like a main, thread in my thesis. This was coming from Clark, 2015. The idea is that you have, you don't really need a proper, accurate model of the environment. And I think what I said so far is already capturing part of the story, where I say I don't care about the structure being the same, I just care about the behavior being the same. But I can actually say more by using the same, oops, did I press too much? Not good. I can actually use the same bisimulation I introduced earlier, in this case, between two copies of the environment. And this gives a nice story for compressions of the environment. This comes out in machine learning, well, reinforcement learning nowadays, where people try to understand task relevant from task irrelevant information of a particular problem. So if something is not, say, if something doesn't make a difference, it should not be treated differently. That's more or less the summary. All right. What is embodiment in this story? Well, it looks to me like this is very brain-centric, because everything I said so far is basically brain, 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 generative model, brain, brain, brain. Arguably, you could say, well, you're getting this picture wrong from the free energy principle, which is, fair enough. You might want to say the thing that I call body is just a membrane, and actually the thing I call brain is actually the whole agent minus the membrane. Again, open to different interpretations there, but we're going to have to commit to something. If you take my view, so the body is this thing, well, the body is basically just rewiring things. So it's just giving a copy of the actions and then just receiving a copy of the same thing from the controller that it is receiving from the environment. I think it is slightly, at least, more interesting that we are not asking structural equivalence, structural isomorphisms between brain and environment. We're just asking that they kind of, produce the same type of outputs. And it is kind of interesting that at least I can compress environments by saying, I don't need to actually consider all possible different behaviors that an environment is producing, just the ones that are relevant for an agent. And I think I'm probably done. Yeah. Summary. Well, you can read it. I mean, basically what I just said. I care about agents, agent environment setup, some new maths, hopefully not too scary. Hopefully something that explains a bit better free energy principle stuff. Thank you.
I'm the audience. Andrew.
Thanks, Manuel. So I don't know if I just misunderstood something quite basic. That's very possible. But I think you said that the observations generated by the generative process must be consistent with the observations generated by the generative model, even if the structures are different. I don't understand how that would square with this idea that the generative model is trying to optimize the trade-off between accuracy and complexity, which to me would suggest that the models can be quite wrong if they're sufficiently simple. So there's, which seems to harken back to this notion that you allude to about the models not matching the structure. So I don't understand how you can hold, on the one hand, you seem to agree with part of that, but on the other hand, they seem to have this need to generate observations that somehow correspond to one another.
Thank you for the question. So the way I look at it, so there is probably some clarity on my side that might help, that might have helped, like, diffusing some of this confusion, which I put, entirely on my side. So when I say environment, and when I say observations by the environment, I actually don't mean the entire, say, universe or the entire, or even the entire set of observations of a particular problem. So let's say that an agent, has really bad sensors, and no matter how complex the environment is, like the poor agent can only read red or blue. Then as long as the agent can produce observations that are consistent with its own, understanding, which is, well, it's either red or blue, I would say that it still meets like the requirements for this framework. But it is, at the same time, you might claim, well, a very poor explanation of the environment, because a lot of complexity gets hidden by the fact that the sensors are really bad. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you so much. So I have lots of questions, but maybe it's easier. So maybe it's easier if you go back to the slide with the agent environment. The relationship, you passed it already. So it's really one of the last slides where I have like agent environment relation between So so you mentioned, and I think I agree with you. You mentioned the fact that the predictive processing model is very much like neurocentric and brain-centric. And actually, there's entire huge discussion where the mind-body voice has been replaced by the brain-body voice, and why exactly the brain doesn't count as a part of the body. Yeah. So yeah, but I would like to. So I'm grateful that you pointed that thing, because I think that's one of the very important points and needs to be discussed. But another one is, I think, might pose a problem for this model as well. It's again connected with the previous talk as well, the development of the stack. Yeah. So if you take very seriously this idea of like self-regulation, like homeostasis, yeah. So the organism forms homeostatic self-regulation way before it has a brain, yeah. So at the cellular level, so you need some sort of like self-organizing mechanism that performs homeostatic exchange between the agent and the environment way before you actually have a brain to model that type of like agent in the environment, yeah. And in that case, here's the problem. The problem is that so if you take an adult-centric and neurocentric perspective, it's quite simple because you have an agent there, and the environment is external, and then you perform action in the environment, which is like go grab a fruit and eat it, you know. But the thing is, if you take it at normal perspective and forget a bit about the brain, then the internal-external relationship doesn't hold anymore, because basically you do have agents inside your body which are not you, but still counts as external environment, where at the same time they're inside your body. It's not they're outside, like the biodynamics type of thing. So if you look at the co-agents type of like a relationship and agent and environment, then I think it's even more complicated than just like a very simple thing. It's like, well, okay, you have an action, you observe the world, you take, action to the world and to perform homeostasis. But actually, we need a model in which the external, it's internal to the body, and the internal is another agent, another biological agent, yeah, which is basically needed to perform homeostasis. So I wonder, how would you describe? Would you be willing to actually add an extra layer of complexity to your model to, take care of this kind of like cases?
So I got a bit lost. I'm gonna try and summarize what I think I understood. One, yes, this is too simple to explain a lot of interesting stuff. I will agree there. Two, I think I'm taking a very liberal perspective on what I call brains, because in a sense, like in artificial life, we are ready to call brains like a lot of things that people will, crucify us for calling brains. So, I'm happy to call brains, like in quotes, the chemical pathways of an E. coli. Like this stuff that I presented of internal model principle is used like in systems biology to study E. coli. Is that a brain like in the neuroscience sense? By no means. It will still fit the quoting for brain that I had here. Then, yeah, boundaries. I'm presupposing boundaries. I don't know where to draw boundaries here. I have no idea. That's an amazing part of research that I want to engage with. I don't know where to draw boundaries here.
Thank you.
One question here.
Thank you very much. I had a question about the part you mentioned on compressing the environment based on the agent's goals. Could you say a bit about how that looks in your framework?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, I got this idea from the literature. Actually, I found I would recommend Amy Zhang's PhD thesis. Amazing stuff on this topic. So basically, they take reinforcement learning setup, and they say the problem is something we can write down as a Markov decision process. And then we're going to define something called a bisimulation for Markov decision processes. That is basically something like, if you start from two different states, but they have the same reward, and from these two different states, you can transition to the same equivalence class of states with the same probabilities, then the two initial states are something you can consider to be the same. So basically, you kind of drop your partitioning the state space into things that, given a particular reward, don't make a difference to you. I don't know if that helps, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Next talk, I'm sorry. Once again, thank you.